more importantly, when our gathering planning group began looking at who we might invite, it was probably about 18 months ago we started this. We made a gap in the ground, in the tilled soil, as gardeners do. And the first 2 or 3 seeds that we put in, Helen Ann was one, that we should have Bible study each day of the gathering was the second one, and right next to that was Gordon Mursell. Known to many here because he spent a lot of time in our neighbouring diocese as Provost and then Dean of Birmingham and then as Bishop of Stafford. He's spoken at one of our diocese conference not so long ago in John Oliver's time, wasn't it? Yes. So it's a welcome back, really. But to us, there was no one really that was, a choice for us other than Gordon Mursell. And I was so delighted when he responded immediately. And said yes. And you've come here to listen to him, not to me. So it's my great delight to invite you, Bishop Gordon, to lead us on the start of the daily Bible study during our gathering. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Please go.
You want to say something else? God, what a daunting sight. I think I'll go home now. Do you want me to start, or are you going to? I feel this is, I think, probably going to be very poor fare after the richness of what Bishop Helen Ann has just shared with us. And just 2 other quick apologies. One is that I'm going to focus on, I'm going to use the material that mentioned from John's Gospel that I mentioned in the programme, but I'm going to do it in a different way. It occurred to me that it would be better just to focus on one passage one chapter for each of these, one chapter for all 3 of these addresses, and just go through it and then move out from that to look at John chapter 1 and whatever the other one was that was mentioned. So just a very slight change, but what you will want, therefore, if you have a Bible in front of you, and I know that you will all know the Bible fluently and won't need, and you've probably got the original Greek on your Kindle, but if you do want to look at the text, what I want to do is work from the last chapter of the Gospel of John, chapter 21. And I need to apologise to Bishop Richard because an earlier version of some of this stuff I used when I was asked to do some addresses to a Wodger Bishop. Whatever you call a sort of gaggle of bishops, a month or 2 ago. So some of this originated with them, and I found after that that chapter 21 has continued to stimulate and stretch me, and I'm not a New Testament expert again, unlike Bishop Helen Ann, and no doubt many of you, but I am an enthusiast for Scripture, as I'm sure you are as well. And if I do no more than remind you of things you've thought about before, I hope that won't be a complete waste of time. I don't intend to go on for more than half an hour, because then after that we've got worship. I want to think in a very general way about the gap in this first section, the gap between us and God, and I want to look at the first half of John 21, that's verses 1 to 14. Then tomorrow, whenever it is tomorrow, I want to look at John 21 verses 15 to 19, Jesus' interrogation of Peter, and finally on Friday, if you survive that, at the very end of the Gospel, John 21 verses, I can't remember, 20 to 25, I think it is. Some people, and I'm not a scholar here, though I have consulted with some who are, some scholars are of the view that John 21 is an appendix, or even possibly added on afterwards. And you can see why people might well think that. John 20 finishes with a kind of sonorous conclusion about there are many other signs that Jesus did that are not included in this book, or something like that. and so on. And anything coming after that might feel a little bit like an anticlimax. I want to argue I've been much influenced. If you're interested in the particular people who've influenced me, I can tell you later, but Richard Borkham is one. Another is an Australian writer, but I'll come back to Dorothy A. Lee a bit later on. But Richard Borkham has argued, by looking very carefully at the two conclusions, the one at the end of chapter 20 and the one at the end of the whole Gospel, that there is a significant difference. And if anything, it seems to me, sorry, let me finish one point first, that the end of chapter 20 talks about the end of the book of signs. And you know how important that word is, the Greek semia, the signs that dominate the Gospel of John, beginning with what do they begin with? The wedding at Cana and culminating in the resurrection. They conclude at the end of chapter 20. Chapter 21 shifts the focus to you and me, to discipleship. There's a sense in which we don't hear anything new about Jesus, but we're presented with some, I think, remarkably invigorating and challenging material for us. But it picks up in chapter 21 something of the sense of anticlimax that we may well experience as we read it. I want to argue, however, that following Richard Borkham, that just as the conclusion of chapter 21 is different from the conclusion of chapter 20, it talks about there are many other things that Jesus did. It's a wider conclusion. So chapter 21 is integral to the Gospel of John. It isn't simply an appendix added on later. Indeed, it seems to me, well, two things. One, that it contains, if not all, a very large number of the key Johannine themes. Love, glory, the world. Several of these I want to look at today or tomorrow, and different aspects of Christian discipleship, like following, abiding, loving, learning, and failure. Come back to that one in a minute, just to cheer you up nowhere. I also think it's at least arguable. Of course, all of this may be just my own view, and I'm very, very keen to learn where I've got this wrong and you've got it right. It'll cost you a gin and no, but it'll be a great. I forgot what I was going to say. I think there is an argument for saying that chapter 21 forms a bracket with the prologue of the Gospel, chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. Okay, they're different in their kind of tone, aren't they? The prologue has a kind of lofty philosophical style to it, whereas chapter 21 is story, but they contain a great deal, I want to argue, of common material that gives a kind of coherence and a kind of bookending, you might say, to use the tedious technical word, an inclusio, a kind of sense of integration to the whole gospel. Both of them are rooted in the idea of witness. In the prologue, the witness, the prime witness to the Word becoming flesh, well, it's partly we have seen his glory, but the prime witness whose name, you'll remember, is John the Baptist. Back to him in a second. In chapter 21, the prime witness is another John, if we assume that the beloved disciple is the Apostle John. And these two Johns together act as witnesses at the beginning of the Gospel and at the end. But there's something, and the word witness is hugely important in John's Gospel. The whole theme, the Greek word marturia, martyr or witness, comes, dash it, I can't find where I've written it, 14 times in the Gospel of John, compared to only 4 in all 3 of the other Gospels put together. And the verb that comes from it, to bear witness or to testify, marturine, comes 33 times in the Gospel of John and only 2 times in all the other 3 Gospels. So bearing witness is an extraordinary, or being a martyr, the word in the Greek is the same, isn't it? Being a witness is a costly thing, is an extraordinarily important theme, not only in chapter 1 and chapter 21, but in the whole Gospel. One of the things that I find exciting, I don't know whether you do, about chapter 1, verses 1 to 18, and I speak with great humility here because this is such majestic prose that it feels to me, a bit like some of the things Bishop Helen Nam was sharing with us, that really what it deserves is contemplation rather than wittering from a clapped-out bishop like me. But I suppose I've started, so I'll finish. But one of the things that does strike me about the majestic prologue is how John, as you know, is talking about incarnation, how the writer actually how can I put it, earths the whole idea of incarnation in the very way he writes. So it isn't just that he's talking about the Word becoming flesh, it's that he makes it flesh in the way he writes. So you get several verses, which I'm not going to repeat to you now in order to save time, but about in the beginning was the Word, picking up Genesis 1 or so, and the Word was with God, and the Word, and so on. We all know it from Christmas. And then suddenly we're interrupted with, there was a man, remember, sent from God, whose name was John. Now, we know this passage so well that the sense of surprise at suddenly being confronted with a bloke, as it seems, or a human being, is sometimes lost on us. But I suggest that this is entirely deliberate, the move from lofty philosophical wisdom to a bloke called John, to the witness to it all. Do you see what I mean? And so the culmination of the prologue is the Word was made flesh, and as occurred at some point in Bishop Helen Ann's thing about camping or dwelling in a tent, coming to dwell in our midst among us. And suddenly we appear in the story. Do you remember? We have seen his glory as of the Father's only Son. And then finally, at the end of the prologue, unexpectedly in the Greek, my Greek is not as good as it should be, but it isn't too bad, unexpectedly in the Greek, not always present in English translations, is the word bosom, which comes as a little bit of a surprise. The authorized version, as I think quite often, is closer here, literally, to the original Greek than the more modern ones are. So the King James Version has the only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father. Okay? The NRSV, in a rather kind of limp, slightly kind of, has God the only Son who is close to the Father's heart. Well, that just slightly misses. Kolpos in Greek, as far as I can see, means a bosom, a breast. So it's talking about a real physical intimacy. So the NRSV is a little bit tame there, and the NIV even more so, who is at the Father's side. That's rather a long way from a bosom. Now, I don't wish to trivialize the text, but I make no apology for simply sharing with you that there in the original Greek is an extraordinary movement from the pre-existent word to bosoms. All right? And without wanting to trivialize it, what I'm simply trying to suggest is that this is part of the evangelist's intention. This is about bridging the gap between God and the world, right? The Word becomes flesh. The Word, who is so intimate with all that God is, as to be describable in terms of being on the Father's bosom, comes close to ours, to us. All right? And thus the gap is between God and us is supremely bridged in incarnation. And the word bosom appears again, a different Greek word but the same meaning, at the very end of John chapter 21 verse 20. The witness, i.e. the beloved disciple, the one who had reclined next to Jesus is the NRSV, but literally who had leaned at the supper on the breast of him at the supper. The same idea comes again. And just as John 1 earths the whole mystery of God, bridging the gap between God and the creation in the very language that's used, so that writer doesn't seem to have any difficulty moving from the transcendent metaphysical wonder of creation and the pre-existent word to a bloke called John, to you and me who've seen this glory, to a tent and bosoms. It's all of a piece. Do you see what I mean? Am I losing you completely? But no. So in chapter 21, though it's less obvious because it's a story that we're being given there, we get something of the same thing. So it begins, after these things, Jesus showed himself again to his disciples, and then a moment or two later, the extraordinarily prosaic words of Peter, I'm going fishing. This manifestation of the divine word made flesh is suddenly given way to, yields place to, a bloke saying, I think I'll go for a fish. It has a slightly anticlimactic, almost kind of aimless feel to it, but we'll come back to that in a moment. It's all about earthing in our own lives the mystery of the Word made flesh, of Jesus who died in our place. And in the last chapter, the gap between the risen Christ and you and I is the gap that's being addressed. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together, Notice that word, isn't that interesting? And you went and asked me to come and address that this is a gathering. John 21 begins with a gathering. In fact, this section, in 20 minutes' time, when I'm going to finish, or just before that, we'll find another gathering at the Eucharist on the lakeside. It begins with a gathering. Gathered there together, 21 verse 2, were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples. Why are those particular disciples mentioned by name? Well, I haven't the faintest idea, but let me suggest to you, I don't know, but I suggest to you, in all seriousness, that the reason those disciples are mentioned by name is that we know one thing about all of those: they're all failures. They all let Jesus down. Peter, who's denied him and is about to make a terrible flop of going fishing all night. Thomas, who doubted the resurrection. Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, who couldn't believe that the Messiah had come from Cana or Hereford, Nathanael might have believed, but if the Messiah is said to come from Nazareth, he couldn't believe it. The sons of Zebedee, who in the Synoptic Gospels wanted to sit on both sides, remember, of Jesus, and 2 others who are not named. They're all people who blew it. They're all failures. In a profound sense, so are we. The Gospel of John, and particularly chapter 21, I suggest, is about the transfiguration of failure. Jesus' grace transforming, bridging the gap between the risen Christ and us, and allowing us to, even failures as we are, to go forth in his service. I had an interesting chat with Archbishop Sentimer, who I knew very well when I worked with him in Birmingham, but I don't see him really now. When I mentioned that particular point when I was meeting with these bishops a month or 2 ago, and he took me up afterwards over a drink, a cup of tea, and said, I don't believe all this stuff about us all being failures. But the more I go back to the more I still think I'm right. Don't dare tell him that, but isn't it the case that again and again in Scripture, almost all of the, as it were, significant figures in Scripture, especially people, most of them men, in leadership roles, Abraham, I can't remember the order now, but anyway, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, David, Solomon, they all turn out to be, in one way or another, disasters. Don't you think? And what's significant, surely, is that the texts that tell us that are in our Bible. These are not records of blameless, stunning, super competent, omni-capable vicars or something. These are stories of people who blew it in one way or another, and yet are called, because, as I hope to suggest tomorrow, they are on the receiving end of this unconditional, incarnate love that makes it possible for them to continue to minister even though they're failures. And think of St. Paul's great thing in 2 Corinthians 6 about we are the impostors who speak the truth, the unknown ones whom everyone knows. Do you remember? Dying, we still live on. Of course, you don't want to argue that the church needs to celebrate failure. I think that was what the Archbishop was a bit anxious I might be implying. But at the same time, isn't there an opposite danger? Shoot me down in flames afterwards if you don't agree, but if we become too obsessed with the kind of professionalized ministry as a discharge of tasks, and everything's all about outcomes and successes and achievements, something of the essence of the gospel gets lost. This chapter is all about failure, and you're not supposed to about failure being transfigured. It's not celebrated, it's transfigured by the love of God. Simon Peter said to them, verse 3, I am going fishing. They said to him, we will go with you. They went out into the boat, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Another flop. And surely there can't be any doubt that there is a deep sense of anticlimax, a kind of is that it feeling. And I hope, because I have, you've sometimes experienced that. Looking at you all now, I'm beginning to feel deeply worried that I better go home. Have you not ever had the experience, because my goodness I have, after some big service or a great Easter and I thought, is that it? All that's left is the Church Times and the Deanery. No, I know. And what does Peter do wrong? I'm going fishing. It's not that he suddenly stops believing in the risen Christ. It's as though he behaves as though Christ were not risen. And that's the danger, or one of the dangers facing the Christian church. Do you see what I mean? He acts as though Christ were not there, were not present. He acts as though the future depends upon him. Do that and we catch nothing. Only when the focus is on Jesus do things begin to happen. Sounds a platitude, but it's true. Notice the naming here. Tomorrow I want to pick up how when Jesus interrogates Peter in the next bit of chapter 21, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He calls him by a different name. Here it's Simon Peter. Simon the fisherman and Peter the rock decides in this moment of anticlimax, he's going to go back to being Simon and he's going to behave as though Christ were not there. And the result is failure again. Notice, but I haven't got time to talk about it now, I will tomorrow, this sense of a potential tension that I want to pick up tomorrow, even in the name Simon Peter, between the public figure, Peter the rock, and the private Simon. All of us in any kind of ministry live within that tension. The tension between the public face you have to present, as you're looking at me now, well, not at me now, but you know what I mean, when you're standing in the door of a church or whatever it is, and the private you, and sometimes an incredibly costly place to be, an immensely big gap that needs somehow integrating. But we'll come back to that tomorrow. Verse 4. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." Well, again, my Greek isn't very good, but I'm pretty certain there that the Greek, which is something like, I can't even read my writing, paideia, mete, prosphagon, children, no fish do you have you? It's one of those questions expecting the answer no, isn't it? You haven't got any fish, have you? No. You know the kind of... I've just remembered him mentioning Andy. I live in Scotland. I'm married to a Scot, and my family's Scot. So Andy Murray is very, very important to the moment. I don't know whether you remember some years ago when he won the Olympic gold medal, and he was represented as going back to his hometown of Dunblane in central belt of Scotland. And he had his gold medal. I don't know whether some of you may remember seeing this, but it was terribly funny. And everyone was sort of clapping and so on, except for one little boy who came up to him and felt the medal and said, "That's not gold, is it? It's chocolate." Do you not remember that? It's terribly funny. "That's not gold, is it? It's chocolate. I've seen them in Tesco's." And poor Andy Murray was mortified. "That's not chocolate, is it? It isn't. It's chocolate." That's another question expecting the answer no. But notice the children, paideia. Jesus is not giving them a rocket. It's the words, I suggest to you, of a loving parent whose children have somehow blown it, but they're no less loved. In fact, maybe they're even more loved, precisely because they've blown it. Kids, you've got it wrong, haven't you? There's a profound sense, though there's no time to think about it now, but in which I was trying to think on the way coming down from Dumfries in the train, in which all prayer in the Christian spiritual tradition is a response to what God is already doing in us. And can I suggest one way into that huge theme are the words of Jesus here. "Children, you have no fish, have you? Gordon, you've blown it, haven't you, that afternoon at the gathering in Hereford, or whoever you are. That didn't go very well, did it?" "No, it didn't, no." But do you see what I mean? Inviting an honesty from us that opens us to receive the unconditional love of God, to bridge the gap between Christ and us. Otherwise, ministry becomes, as I've just said, the discharge of professional skills, and it all is about you or me. Jesus breaks through all that. You're a child, and so am I. And the older we get, the more important it is to remember that. Children, you've messed up, haven't you? It exposes them to Jesus' love. Verse 6, he said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. Is this a miracle? The reading doesn't actually tell us. Or is it that Jesus, standing on the shore, is able to see in a different way and to open them up to an alternative view of things? I think it could be either of those. I was thinking, listening to Bishop Helen, I forgot what Helen was saying now about Matthew 14, but that could well be part of the background, even though I know it's not in John's Gospel here. Do you remember that wonderful, well, Bishop Helen Ann talked about it, but when Jesus, the other moment when Peter's in a boat and Jesus is, no, in that case, Jesus walks across the water. Do you remember that wonderful moment when Peter says to Jesus, to my mind, one of the great prayers in Scripture, Lord, if it is you, bid me come to you on the water. It's a prayer that's wonderful because it's a fantastic mix of honest doubt, which again the bishop picked up just before tea. If it is you, I don't know whether that is you out there. In fact, to be quite honest, Lord, I'm rather hoping it isn't, because I prefer sitting in the boat than try walking on the water. Unfortunately for Peter, it is Jesus. And but Peter says, if it is you, bid me come to you on the water. Doubt, honest doubt, and outrageous childlike boldness. Let me have a go at stepping out of the boat and walking towards you. And he does. There's a miracle for about a minute. And then he takes his eyes off Jesus and notices the wind, and whee, down he goes into the water. The borderline between the miraculous and the everyday, the gap between the supernatural and the natural, is an immensely porous membrane. It's constantly open to us to move back and forward through it, but it requires that combination of honest doubt and outrageous aspiration. But much more important, it involves keeping our eyes focused on Jesus. Anyway, let me suggest that whether in John 21 this is a miracle or just Jesus inviting them to see things from a different point of view, it is transforming. Jesus, and this is very Johannine, I think, is constantly in that gospel inviting people, including people who've never seen anything, like the blind man in chapter 9, to see, but to see things differently, not the way the religious bigwigs see, to see a different vision, a subversive vision of reality, which is what happens there. But anyway, to move on, I'm nearly finished. Well, I haven't quite nearly finished, but in about another 5 minutes or so. Is that all right? Can you bear just a few more? Verse 7. The disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. I'm going to come to a moment to the great Swiss theologian Hans von Balthasar, who, although I've read quite a lot of his stuff, and I don't agree with all of it at all, but I found him very stimulating about this particular text. But the only joke I've ever come across in Balthasar's writings, I've suddenly remembered we've got some lovely German visitors who've probably all read it in the original German, who can tell me but somehow Balthasar doesn't come over to me as a kind of, I don't know, a sort of Eddie Izzard of the theological world. But he does make one really rather good joke. I hope Bishop Richard and Bishop Alistair and Bishop Helen Ann, you probably already know this. In relation to this passage, why did Peter put his clothes on in order to jump into the sea? Because, said Balthasar, it's a typical bishop. They couldn't bear the thought of appearing in front of Jesus without wearing their cope and mitre, so they put it all on and jump into the water. Someone else suggested, and I think this is frankly a more likely theory, is it possible? John's Gospel is so rich that you can see any number of meanings in each of these images, but is it possible the reason Peter put his clothes on is because in some sense he's still under the tragedy of the Garden of Eden, where people had to clothe themselves, do you remember? Because they couldn't face God naked. There may be part of that. We are the same. There's another gap that needs bridging. We put clothes on, or call ourselves the terrifically reverend, or the frightfully important, or whatever it is. And all those things, if we're not careful, get in the way of the child in me and you, and the living incarnate Christ, who's just waiting to break down that barrier. Anyway, whatever the reason, notice one other thing. Jesus appears unrecognized and not in the boat. As in Matthew chapter 14, the boat represents the church with the disciples in it. Is Jesus in the boat? No. He's in the world, waiting for us to step out of the boat and meet him in the world. Another gap that takes huge faith and courage to step out of Matthew 14, look foolish, and plunge into the water. Anyway, What I want just 2 points really to finish. One, going back to Balthazar, and then the other about the Eucharist at the lakeside, which finishes this section of chapter 21. What Hans von Balthasar talks about, he talks at length in several of his books about different profiles of the church, different ways of, different characters in Scripture who represent a different way of seeing what Christian faith is all about, really. Mary, the Marian profile he talks about. Some of what he writes is very conservative. I have to be careful what I say here. No, I don't think I do, really. When you're retired, it doesn't really matter very much what you say. But I can't go all the way with Balthasar, and if you do want to read his stuff on Mary, then I do recommend Tina Beattie's book about Catholic feminism, because she has a very profound critique of him. However, what he says about John 21, which, in case you're interested, comes in a book, a relatively short book by him, i.e. it's only about 400 pages, called Mysterium Paschali, or the Easter Mystery. Balthasar suggests that Peter and the beloved disciple here represent two different ways of seeing or understanding the church. Peter represents the church of office, the visible institutional church with its synods and its committees and its its ministry and its visible outward form, its institutional form. The beloved disciple, by tradition the Apostle John, represents what he calls the church of love, the contemplative church, the housebound person who doesn't get up and wab it on leather on, as they say in Scotland, as I'm doing now. The people who don't tend to take the best seats or wear the grandest clothes in our churches. The religious communities, the silent people who see the presence of Christ in the world and point out that presence to the institutional church, which on its own will frequently fail to see where Christ is at work. Do you see what I mean? That's Balthasar's point, and there isn't really time to do more than just leave you with it. But what I think we can legitimately take from this, and I've almost finished now, is that Peter here in this chapter, if you take Balthasar's distinction, and I mean, his whole point is that the distinction between the church of office and the church of love is a distinction that runs right down the middle of all of us. I'm not saying you can laugh at we don't need the visible church. We do need the visible institutional church. But the visible institutional church will get preoccupied with a kind of sterile busyness, is, I suggest, the theme of chapter 21. I'm going fishing, all on my own. I don't need to see Christ. We would never dream of admitting that that's how we see things, but how many PCC or synod meetings have you sat through where the risen Christ barely seems to scratch a hint of a presence? Do you see what I mean? Let alone the wise and probably not very talkative person who says, what about the Christ who's out there in the street or in the village? Are we getting that lovely image of Bishop Helen Nance, one of the many things I will take away about the back garden. Anyway, you see the point. I'm trying to hurry in order to get this through. Rather, we need to be constantly alert to the voices in our Christian communities who will point out the presence of the risen Christ in places we wouldn't have expected it. Dorothy A. Lee, who I think is a wonderful, Bishop Helen Nance probably knows her, but an Australian theologian, in her book Hallowed in Truth and Love, which is all about the spirituality of John's Gospel, says, in John's Gospel, discipleship is not primarily about effort and achievement, although the evangelist describes it as both fruitful and dynamic. Rather, the priority is on abiding and homecoming, on mutual love. All of this I want to look at tomorrow. Discipleship's roots lie in contemplation, in the gaze of adoration, in the work of learning to live together, abiding, in meditative love, and in the welcoming embrace of God as reflected in the life of the community. And so, to conclude with the beautiful description in verses 12, 13 and 14 of the breakfast. Remember this lovely image of the Eucharist, in which both the church of office, represented by Peter, with his funny clothes all on, although wet, and the church of love, represented by the beloved disciple, who points out who Jesus is and where he is, both polarities come together. The meal consists partly of the fish, as William Temple pointed out in a classic book written a long time, well, obviously a long time ago because he died a long time ago, called Readings in St. John's Gospel. He talks about how the breakfast in John 21 is or the Eucharist is the fruit both of what human disciples have caught under Jesus' direction, and of what Jesus himself provides. There's bread and fish already cooking before they get there. Do you see what I mean? So the Eucharist is both what you and I bring, that we've caught under Christ's direction, try the other side and you'll find something, and of pure gift, of what we could never have got on our own. And the result, 2 points to finish, is astonishingly prodigious. How many fish do they have? 153. So far as I can see, every commentator on John's Gospel's got a different view about why it's 153, but maybe I'm a little bit old-fashioned. I don't have a huge reverence for St. Jerome, the great biblical translator, but I have a nasty feeling, well, I don't know about a nasty, I have a feeling he's the one who's got it right. He suggests, back in the 4th century, why is it 153? Because in his day, there were 153 known species of fish. So the symbol represents completeness. And isn't that typical of John's Gospel? Look at the gallons and gallons of booze in the story of the wedding at Cana. It's all about superabundance. The wonderful reference again in the prologue about of his fullness have we all received, grace upon grace. And here, 153 fish for 7 people. It's unspeakably ridiculous, and that's the point. It's an extravagant banquet to which you and I are invited, but through us, so's the world, and our task is to go and get them in. And this section, and here I'll stop, John 21 verses 1 to 14 ends with another gathering. Begins with that anticlimactic group of disciples not sure what to do, but deciding they'll have a go at going fishing, and in the end it's fruitless until they recognize Christ and hear what he says. It ends with a different kind of gathering. On the one hand, sterile, useless busyness. On the other, Christ-centered worship that in the end changes lives. It's that Christ-centered worship that bridges the gap and goes on bridging the gap between God and the world, and gives us the nourishment and the confidence to go out into the world and communicate that love. But of that, a bit more tomorrow. I'm sorry, I've gone on a bit longer than I meant to. Five minutes less before. Take a sweetie.
Bishop Gordon's been very kind and created a breathing space for us, but I think we would have liked him to go on much longer still. But it has been a day of great riches, and you've woven some glorious more threads into it for us. If you happen to stick your head in the bar this evening, there should be a row of gin and tonics lined up for you. And we now have to be patient and wait for 24 hours to our next session with you. But thank you.